In 1943, while over 120,000 Japanese Americans were being held behind barbed wire in desolate internment camps across the United States, their homes and businesses lost, their loyalty questioned, and their freedom stripped away by their own government, a group of young men from within those very camps made an extraordinary decision. They volunteered to fight for the country that had imprisoned them. They were the sons of farmers, fishermen, and shopkeepers, American-born citizens who were now considered a threat to national security. And yet, they chose to put on the uniform of the U.S. Army to prove, with their own blood, what their government refused to believe, that they were loyal Americans. They would form the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a segregated unit composed almost entirely of Japanese Americans. They adopted a simple, powerful motto that defined their ethos: go for broke. And in the brutal mountains of Italy and the dark forests of France, they would fight with a ferocity and a suicidal courage that would leave their allies and their enemies in stunned disbelief. This is the hidden story of the 442nd. It's the tale of how a group of men, fighting to free a world from tyranny while their own families lived as prisoners, became the most decorated unit of its size and length of service in the entire history of the United States Army. This is the story of the soldiers who had to fight two wars, one against the Nazis and another against the prejudice of their own country. The story begins in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. In a wave of war hysteria and deep-seated racism, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order authorized the forced removal and incarceration of all people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. 2/3 of them were Nisei, American citizens by birth. They were given just days to sell or store their possessions, abandoning homes, farms, and businesses they had spent their lives building. They were loaded onto trains and sent to 10 desolate relocation centers in the middle of the American desert and swamplands, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. Initially, all Japanese Americans were classified as for sea or enemy aliens and were barred from military service. But many of the young Nisei men in the camps were desperate to prove their loyalty. They petitioned the government, demanding the right to fight for their country. In 1943, the War Department, facing a manpower shortage and seeing a public relations opportunity, reversed its policy. They would form a segregated all-Nisei combat unit. The call for volunteers went out in the camps. The response was mixed. Many felt it was a deep insult to be asked to die for a country that was treating their families as prisoners. But thousands of others saw it as their only chance to reclaim their honor and prove their Americanism in the only way the country seemed to understand, through combat and sacrifice. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was born. They trained at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where they immediately faced the racism of the segregated South. But under the command of white officers who quickly came to respect their discipline and motivation, they forged themselves into an elite fighting force. They were often smaller than the average GI, but they were tough, smart, and driven by a collective, burning desire to prove themselves. Their motto, "Go for broke," was a Hawaiian gambling term meaning to risk everything on a single roll of the dice. It was a perfect summary of their situation. In May of 1944, the 442nd shipped out to the brutal Italian campaign. They were thrown into the fight to break the German Gothic Line, a series of formidable mountain defenses. Here, in the rugged Apennine Mountains, they immediately established their reputation. They fought with a terrifying ferocity. They would repeatedly make frontal assaults up steep, heavily defended hills that veteran units had deemed impossible to take. Their casualty rates were staggering, but they never stopped advancing. They quickly became known as the Purple Heart Battalion, not as a joke, but as a statement of fact, because so many of them were wounded or killed. But it was in the forests of France in October of 1944 that the 442nd would face its defining test, a battle so brutal and so costly that it would become a legend in the annals of the U.S. Army. The 141st Infantry Regiment of the 36th Texas Division had pushed too far, too fast into the dense, cold forests of the Vosges Mountains. They had been cut off and surrounded by German forces. For days, the Lost Battalion, as they came to be known, was trapped, running out of food, water, and ammunition, and taking heavy casualties. Other units tried to break through to them and failed. The situation was desperate. Finally, the High Command turned to the 442nd. The order was simple: rescue the lost battalion at any cost. The men of the 442nd knew what they were being asked to do. They were being sent on a suicide mission to attack a heavily entrenched German force that had already chewed up other American units. But they did not hesitate. For 5 straight days, they threw themselves against the German lines in a series of relentless, almost inhuman assaults. The fighting was at close quarters, in a dark, cold, and rain-soaked forest that the Germans had turned into a death trap of machine gun nests and artillery kill zones. The casualties were horrific. The 442nd would take a hill, only to be pushed off by a German counterattack. They would take it again, losing more men. The forest floor became littered with the bodies of the Nisei soldiers. Companies were reduced to the size of platoons. Platoons were reduced to a handful of men. One unit, a company, started the assault with 185 men. After a single day of fighting, only 8 remained. But they never stopped. They were driven by their motto, "Go for broke." On the 5th day of the attack, they finally broke through the last German line. A patrol from the 442nd made contact with the beleaguered Texans. They had reached the lost battalion. When the final accounting was done, the numbers were staggering. To rescue 211 men of the lost battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team had suffered over 800 casualties. They had paid a price of almost 4 of their own men for every 1 man they saved. It was one of the most costly small unit actions of the entire war. When the commander of the 36th Division reviewed the handful of survivors of the 442nd who had led the final assault, he was reportedly so overcome with emotion at the sight of how few men were left that he could not speak. The legacy of the 442nd was written in blood. Over the course of the war, the unit earned more than 18,000 individual decorations for bravery, including an unprecedented 21 medals of honor. They had the highest casualty rate of any unit of their size in the Army. They had proven their loyalty beyond any possible doubt. But their victory was a bitter one. While they were fighting and dying in Europe, their parents, their brothers, and their sisters were still living behind the barbed wire of America's internment camps. Soldiers would receive letters from home, not from a familiar street address, but from Barack 14, Block 7, Rower Relocation Center, Arkansas. They were fighting for freedoms abroad that were being denied to their own families at home. When the war ended and the soldiers of the 442nd returned to the United States, they were not always greeted as heroes. They still faced racism and prejudice. Some returned to their hometowns on the West Coast to find their family homes had been seized and their neighbors were hostile. They had won the war against fascism in Europe, but they now had to face the long, quiet battle for acceptance in their own country. The story of the 442nd is a story of a profound and painful paradox. It is a testament to the incredible courage of a group of men who were willing to sacrifice everything for a nation that had branded them as the enemy. They were forced to prove their Americanism in the most brutal way imaginable, and they did so with a heroism that is almost unparalleled in military history. They went for broke, and in doing so, they not only saved their comrades and helped win the war, but they also won a crucial victory in the fight for civil rights and justice back home. Their story is a true hidden front, a battle fought not just on the fields of Europe, but in the heart and soul of America itself.